I never believed my grandfather was insane until I inherited the proof of his madness, or perhaps his clarity. The lawyer handed me the keys to a property I didn't know existed, a square of desert earth 3 hours north of Reno, where the land turns hostile and the sky opens up like a wound. My grandfather and I hadn't spoken in 15 years, not since he abandoned his comfortable retirement to chase what my family called delusions into the Nevada wasteland. Now he was gone, died alone in that wilderness he'd chosen over us, and I was the sole inheritor of whatever obsession had consumed his final days. I drove out there expecting to find the remnants of a broken mind, maybe some explanation I could offer my mother to ease her decades of wondering why her father had turned his back on everything familiar. Instead, I found a carefully maintained cabin perched on the edge of a canyon, so deep the bottom disappeared into permanent shadow. And inside those 4 walls, I discovered that my grandfather hadn't lost his mind at all. He'd simply seen something the rest of us were blessed or cursed not to see. The moment I stepped through that door, I knew I'd entered a space where someone had dedicated every waking hour to a singular, consuming purpose. The walls were papered with maps, not of roads or territories, but of stars, constellations I recognized and patterns I didn't, all marked with red ink and connected by threads of string that created a 3-dimensional web across the entire main room. Journals were stacked on every surface, dozens of them, leather-bound and water-stained, filled with my grandfather's meticulous handwriting that grew more frantic toward the recent volumes. Photographs covered the spaces between maps, faces of strangers with dates and locations written beneath them, and notes like "returned after 6 days," or speech patterns altered, or simply question marks that seemed to carry their own weight of dread. There was a workbench cluttered with soil samples in labeled jars, compasses that spun uselessly in circles, and a Geiger counter that looked like it had seen heavy use. But what stopped me cold was the large topographical map spread across the dining table, marked with dozens of red X's in a 50-mile radius around the cabin, and beside each X, a name, a date, and the single word, disappeared. I spent the first day in a state of numb cataloging, trying to organize the chaos into something comprehensible, telling myself this was just the sad archive of a lonely man who'd let conspiracy theories fill the void where family should have been. But the documentation was too precise, too methodical, cross-referenced with newspaper clippings and missing persons reports that matched his records exactly. He'd marked locations near ancient petroglyphs, those mysterious rock carvings left by peoples whose names we've forgotten, and noted recurring elements at each site: circular burns in the earth, electronic devices found drained of all power, and witnesses who reported geometric lights moving with impossible precision across the desert night. What disturbed me most was how his writing shifted over the years, starting with the detached curiosity of an amateur investigator and evolving into something that read like field notes from someone living inside the phenomenon he was studying. His later entries dropped all pretense of objective distance, referring to them and the returned and the changed ones, as if these were established facts requiring no explanation. On the wall above his bed, written in black marker in letters 6 inches tall, was a message that felt like it had been left specifically for whoever came after him. They don't take bodies, they return them changed. That night, alone in the cabin with the desert wind, testing the windows and the vast, indifferent stars pressing down through the darkness, I sat reading his journals by lamplight and felt the particular loneliness that comes from discovering someone you thought you knew was actually a stranger, living a secret life of terrible significance. My grandfather had been out here for 13 years, documenting disappearances that official records dismissed or ignored, tracking people who came back from the desert fundamentally altered in ways he struggled to articulate but desperately tried to capture. He wrote about eyes that reflected light wrong, about speech that sounded almost but not quite human, about a community of the changed living, somewhere in these hills, and about his growing certainty that whatever was happening wasn't random, it was selection. And as I turned the pages deeper into his final months, I began to understand that he hadn't been warning the world about these disappearances. He'd been warning them about what came back. The second day began with me standing in the pale morning light, spreading out the contents of a wooden filing cabinet that had been locked with a combination I found written inside his final journal, not hidden, but marked with a simple notation, "For whoever comes looking." Inside were folders organized by year, each containing case files that would have seemed absurd if they weren't so, meticulously documented with police reports, medical records, and witness statements my grandfather had somehow obtained. There were 17 people in total, 17 locals from surrounding counties who had disappeared near clusters of ancient petroglyphs scattered throughout this region of Nevada, those enigmatic spirals and humanoid figures carved into rock faces by hands that turned to dust centuries before history learned to write itself down. What made these cases extraordinary wasn't the disappearances themselves. People vanish in the desert with tragic regularity, claimed by heat or disorientation or simple misfortune, but what happened after? 16 of the 17 had returned, walking out of the wilderness days or weeks later with no memory of where they'd been. No signs of dehydration or exposure, and something indefinably wrong that families couldn't articulate but felt in their bones. My grandfather had tracked them all, conducted interviews disguised as friendly check-ins, documented the subtle changes that physicians and authorities dismissed as trauma or coincidence. I spread the photographs across the floor and saw patterns I wished I could unsee, consistencies that transformed random tragedy into something that looked disturbingly like methodology. Each disappearance site was marked by the same evidence: circular burn patterns in the earth, perfectly geometric and ranging from 10 to 30 feet in diameter, with vegetation inside the circles not destroyed, but altered, growing in spiral patterns that defied natural explanation. Electronic devices found nearby were completely drained, not just of battery, but somehow degraded. Their circuits fused in ways that made technicians question what kind of electromagnetic pulse could cause such specific damage. Witnesses who'd been in the vicinity during the disappearances reported lights that moved with mechanical precision, geometric formations that held stable positions for hours before vanishing instantaneously, and a sound one person described as the hum of something vast. Thinking, but it was the documentation of the returned individuals that truly unsettled me, because my grandfather hadn't just recorded their reappearances, he'd been tracking their lives afterward, noting changes so subtle they might have escaped notice if you weren't looking for them. Sleep patterns disrupted permanently, people who now remained awake for days without apparent exhaustion, dietary changes, sudden vegetarianism, or complete loss of interest in food beyond minimal sustenance. And always, that note about their eyes catching light wrong, reflecting it back like the tapetum lucidum of nocturnal animals, a biological feature humans simply don't possess. The most disturbing folder contained medical records my grandfather had obtained through means I didn't want to examine too closely, showing that several of the returned had undergone testing for various complaints their families insisted upon. The results were simultaneously normal and impossible. Brain scans showing unusual symmetry in neural patterns, blood work revealing elevated levels of certain proteins associated with rapid cellular regeneration, and in 3 cases, notes from confused physicians about unexpected findings in genetic testing, variations that didn't match the baseline samples taken from the same individuals years earlier during routine procedures. My grandfather had highlighted one doctor's comment in red ink: "Patient's DNA shows markers consistent with original identity, but with additional sequences of unknown origin and function, as if something has been written into the existing code." Attached to these medical mysteries were his own observations from conversations he'd managed to have with some of the returned before they stopped answering his calls, testimonies that read like accounts from people trying to describe colors that don't exist in human perception. They spoke about places that weren't places, about being unmade and carefully reconstructed, about seeing themselves from outside and understanding for the first time how limited their previous existence had been. One woman told him it was like being a child who'd only ever seen photographs of the ocean, finally standing before its infinite expanse. The final item in that cabinet was a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my grandfather's hand, and inside was a single-page letter and a small cloth bundle that felt heavy, with significance before I even unwrapped it. The letter was brief, written with the clarity of someone who knew their time was limited and wanted to convey only what was essential. And it contained the warning that now wouldn't let me sleep. They don't take bodies. They return them changed, improved in ways we're not equipped to understand or evaluate, stripped of something they consider unnecessary. I call it the shadow of self, that part of us that doubts and fears and feels separate from the universe. The returned ones move through the world without it, and they are content in ways that terrify me more than any abduction could. If you're reading this, you've come looking, and that means you have the same stubborn streak that brought me out here. Be careful. The petroglyphs aren't prehistoric art. They're markers, maps to places where the boundaries are thin, and whatever waits on the other side has been here far longer than our species has had language to describe it. Inside the cloth bundle was a fragment of rock covered in the spiral patterns I'd seen in the photographs, and when I held it up to the morning light streaming through the cabin window, I saw that the carved lines seemed to shimmer slightly, as if the stone remembered the hands that had worked it, and those hands had known something we'd forgotten how to see. The third night, I couldn't stay inside the cabin any longer. Couldn't sit surrounded by my grandfather's documentation of impossible things while pretending the world still made the kind of sense I'd relied upon for 32 years of carefully rational existence. I'd spent the day walking the perimeter of his property, finding more of those marked stones, half buried in the hardpan, feeling their strange warmth even in the cooling desert evening, and when darkness finally came, it brought with it a sky so dense with stars, I felt I could fall upward into them. That's when I saw the lights beyond the ridge to the east, not the steady glow of distant houses or the predictable arc of aircraft, but something that pulsed with organic rhythm, 3 distinct points of brilliance that moved in slow rotation around some invisible center, casting shadows that seemed to reach across miles of empty land. Every rational part of me said to go inside, lock the door, pretend I'd seen nothing more mysterious than some atmospheric phenomenon or military exercise from the base 2. Counties over. But my grandfather's letter had awakened something in me, a need to see what he'd seen, to understand what had consumed his final years, and so I found myself loading a backpack with water and flashlight and walking out into the darkness with the kind of certainty that comes not from courage, but from the recognition that some invitations cannot be declined. The terrain grew rougher as I climbed ancient arroyos, cutting through volcanic rock that looked black as space in the starlight, and the lights ahead maintained their distance no matter how long I walked, as if they existed in a geography that didn't correspond to the physical world my boots were crossing. I'd been hiking for what felt like an hour when I noticed the lights had stopped moving. Holding position in what I knew from my earlier explorations was a box canyon, one of those dead-end formations where flash floods had carved deep into the mesa over millennia of patient erosion. As I approached the canyon mouth, the lights suddenly vanished, not fading, but simply ceasing to exist between one moment and the next. And in the profound darkness that followed, I heard something that made me stop breathing. Footsteps, uneven and stumbling, coming toward me from inside the canyon, where no rational person would have been wandering at this hour. I switched on my flashlight, and the beam caught her. About 30 feet ahead, a woman in what had once been jeans and a white shirt, both now torn and stained with red dust, walking barefoot across rock that should have shredded her feet but left no trail of blood. Her face turned toward my light without squinting, without the normal human reaction to sudden brightness, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like someone remembering how language worked after a long absence from the need for words. She said my grandfather's name first, not as a question but as a recognition, and then she said mine, and the wrongness of that hit me like cold water, because I'd never been to this place before, had no connection to this region except through blood and inheritance. "You look like his photographs," she continued, her words coming in fractured rhythm, spaces between them filled with something that might have been thought or might have been communication, happening in frequencies I couldn't detect. He took so many pictures, documented all of us, tried to understand what we'd become after we saw the garden between stars, after they showed us what human consciousness looks like from outside the cage of singular perspective. She moved closer, and I saw her eyes catch my flashlight beam and throw it back, that animal reflection my grandfather had noted in his files, and I understood with a lurch of displaced reality that this was one of them, one of the returned ones, and she'd been waiting here or been drawn here or somehow known I would come. Her feet were unmarked, despite the terrain. Her skin had a quality of smoothness that seemed almost translucent in the artificial light, and when she reached out to touch my arm, her hand was fever-warm, her fingers moving with the precise articulation of something that had been carefully calibrated. "He sent you the letter," she said, and it wasn't a question, and I realized she was reading my confirmation in ways that had nothing to do with my expression or body language, perceiving my thoughts through some sense that evolution hadn't given to baseline humanity. "They're waiting to meet you," she said, and gestured back toward the canyon with a movement so fluid it looked choreographed, and despite every survival instinct screaming warnings I couldn't articulate, I followed her into that darkness beyond my flashlight's reach, into a space where the rock walls seemed to curve wrong and the stars overhead appeared brighter and arranged in patterns I'd never learned in any astronomy class. She walked ahead of me with absolute confidence in terrain she couldn't possibly see, and I understood that whatever had happened to her in this place, or places like it, had rewritten her relationship with physical reality, had given her senses that made navigation in absolute darkness as natural as breathing. The canyon opened into a wider chamber, where I could hear water somewhere, an underground spring that had carved this secret space, and I thought I heard other sounds too, breathing, movement, the suggestion of presence all around me in the dark. "Your grandfather came here once," she said, her voice echoing. Strangely off stone surfaces I couldn't see. He saw us as we truly are now, and it terrified him so completely he spent his remaining years trying to warn a world that isn't ready to understand what we've become, what we've been invited to transcend. Then she turned to face me fully, and in the scattered starlight filtering down through some opening in the rock above, I saw her smile with an expression of contentment so absolute and inhuman it made my blood run cold. The woman, though that word felt increasingly inadequate for what she'd become, led me to a flat section of rock and sat with the unself-conscious grace of something that had forgotten human awkwardness. In the darkness I heard others approaching, their footsteps perfectly synchronized in a way that suggested hive coordination rather than coincidence, and as my eyes adjusted, I began to perceive them. Perhaps a dozen figures arranged in a loose circle around us, their bodies absolutely still in that unnatural way my grandfather had described, that absence of the constant micro-movements that define human presence. She reached into her torn shirt and produced a photograph so worn the edges had gone soft as fabric, and even in the dim starlight I recognized my grandfather's handwriting on the back, recognized the date from 3 years ago, recognized the location as this very canyon. "He gave this to me when I still remembered fear," she said, her fractured speech pattern smoothing slightly as if proximity to me was helping her recall the rhythms of normal human communication. He wanted me to remember what I'd been before the lights took me, before they showed me the beautiful machinery underneath consciousness, the patterns that connect all living things to the vast mathematics of existence. But I don't want to remember that confusion anymore, that prison of singular perspective where every moment was separation and every thought was loneliness. Her words carried a conviction that transcended mere belief, and as the others began to hum, that's the only word I have for the sound they made, though it seemed to vibrate through the stone itself rather than traveling through air. I felt something shift in my perception, as if reality was showing me angles that human neurology wasn't designed to process. She told me then what my grandfather had spent years documenting, speaking in that strange halfway language of someone, translating experiences that existed beyond vocabulary. The returned ones weren't victims, but volunteers, people who'd been chosen or had chosen. She couldn't quite articulate which, to experience what she called the garden between stars, a place that wasn't physical but wasn't entirely conceptual either, where consciousness could be examined like a specimen and gently, carefully, lovingly remade. "They don't hurt us," she said, and reached out to take my hand with fingers that felt too warm, too precisely articulated, each small bone moving with mechanical perfection beneath skin that seemed to glow faintly with its own light. They removed the parts that cause suffering, the illusion of separation, the shadow of self that makes humans feel so desperately alone in the universe. Your grandfather couldn't accept that gift, couldn't surrender the pain that he thought defined his humanity, and so he ran and spent his remaining years trying to rescue us from the only peace he'd ever actually encountered. As she spoke, the others moved closer, and I saw their eyes reflecting the starlight in colors that shifted between gold and green, and something that had no name in any spectrum I'd learned, and I understood my grandfather's terror, because there was something so profoundly wrong in their perfection, their absolute contentment, their total lack of the existential anxiety that drives human ambition and art and love. Yet she still held my hand with something that resembled tenderness, and when she showed me more photographs, dozens of them that my grandfather had taken, documenting the returned ones over years of obsessive study, I saw in their faces a kind of transformation that could be read as either transcendence or erasure, evolution, or extinction of everything that made consciousness recognize itself in mirrors. "He took pictures of all of us," she said, spreading them across the stone like tarot cards, revealing a future I couldn't escape. Trying to find the moment where we stopped being human, trying to identify exactly what they took from us. But he never understood that nothing was taken, only given, only expanded beyond the narrow bandwidth of unmodified human perception. He photographed me 17 times over 2 years, and in every image you can see me becoming more of what I was always meant to be. If humans weren't so attached to their suffering, their beautiful, terrible isolation. I looked at the progression of images and saw it was true. Saw her face growing more serene, more symmetrical, more absolutely empty of the 1,000 tiny tensions that define human expression, and she leaned closer, her breath carrying a scent like ozone and honey, and whispered with something that might have been the last fragment of her original personality. "He left you the letter because he saw it in you too, that readiness, that crack in the armor of normal human consciousness, where the light could get in and reshape what it found there. And he wanted to warn you, but also couldn't help hoping you'd be braver than he was, that you'd accept what he refused." The woman, I later learned her name had been Sarah, though she no longer answered to it, rose with that liquid grace and gestured for me to follow, and the others parted like a curtain of flesh as we walked deeper into the canyon where moonlight couldn't reach. I used my phone's flashlight until she gently pressed my hand down, whispering that I wouldn't need it, that my eyes would adjust to frequencies of light that human retinas could perceive, but human brains typically filtered out as noise. She was right, and within minutes, I began to see the desert floor glowing with bioluminescent traceries, patterns of energy or fungus or something beyond my comprehension, leading us toward what appeared to be a collapsed mine. Shaft, but revealed itself as something far older, a descending passage carved with symbols that predated any Native American petroglyphs I'd studied. The returned ones moved ahead of us in perfect formation, their bodies generating that faint phosphorescence that made them look like deep-sea creatures adapted to eternal darkness. And as we descended, I felt the temperature drop and the air grow thick with a humidity that had no place in the Nevada desert, as if we were entering an ecosystem that operated by entirely different rules of physics. The passage opened into a vast underground chamber, and what I saw there made my grandfather's terror finally comprehensible, because this wasn't a hiding place or a shelter, but a home, a thriving community carved into the living rock, with architecture that seemed to grow organically from the stone itself. They had built, or perhaps cultivated, the distinction wasn't clear, dwelling spaces that resembled honeycomb cells, each one containing the minimal possessions of lives stripped down to pure function. And as more of the returned ones emerged from these chambers, I realized there were far more than a dozen, perhaps 50 or 60 people of various ages and backgrounds, united only by that same unsettling perfection of movement and that reflective quality in their eyes. Children played in absolute silence, their games following mathematical patterns rather than childish chaos, arranging stones in formations that hurt to look at directly, geometries that seemed to contain more angles than three-dimensional space should allow. A man who might have been a businessman in his previous life now tended to gardens of plants I couldn't identify, their leaves crystalline, and their roots growing directly into solid rock, fed by water that seeped from cracks in impossible defiance of the desert above. Sarah led me past cooking fires that burned without smoke, their flames a cool blue that provided light but no heat, around which the returned ones prepared food with the coordinated precision of surgical teams, each movement economical and purposeful, nothing wasted, nothing accidental, every gesture part of a larger pattern I could sense but not comprehend. They watched me with collective interest as we passed, their gazes lacking curiosity or suspicion or any recognizable human social calculation, simply observing with the neutral attention of scientists, studying a specimen that had wandered into their laboratory. At the chamber's center stood what Sarah called the gathering place, a natural amphitheater where the stone had been worn smooth by countless bodies over what must have been decades or longer, and carved into the floor was a mandala of such complexity that looking at it made my vision blur and my thoughts scatter into fragments. "This is where we come when the calling grows strong," she said, her voice carrying that dual quality of speaking both to me and to the assembled community, as if individual conversation was becoming difficult for her to maintain. "Where we remember what was shown to us in the garden between stars, where we practice the harmonies that will prepare us for the next visitation, when those who are ready will be taken up to complete the transformation, and those who are not will continue the work here, documenting and recruiting and waiting." The others had begun to gather around us now, forming concentric circles that positioned me at the center, with mathematical precision, and they started that humming sound again, but louder now, layered in frequencies that made my bones resonate and my teeth ache, and something deep in my brainstem respond with recognition that predated language. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything that would reassert my individual human agency against this collective consciousness that seemed to be reaching for me with invisible tendrils. But I also felt something loosening inside my chest, some knot of anxiety that I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it wasn't natural, and the humming promised release from that tension, promised belonging without judgment, promised an end to the exhausting performance of maintaining a coherent self. Sarah knelt beside the mandala and placed both palms against its surface, and the pattern began to glow with that same bioluminescent light, pulsing in rhythm with the humming. And I understood with absolute. I found my grandfather's final journal not in the cabin, but here in the underground chamber, tucked into a niche beside one of the dwelling cells, where Sarah led me after the humming ceremony had ended and the returned ones had dispersed to their incomprehensible tasks with that same synchronized grace. The leather binding had degraded in the humidity, pages swollen and warped, but his handwriting remained legible in the distinctive architect's print he'd maintained throughout his career, though the later entries devolved into frantic scrawl, interrupted by diagrams of cosmic geometries and sketches of faces that looked human but fundamentally weren't. Mouths open in expressions that could have been ecstasy or terror or something beyond that binary. My hands trembled as I read his account of the night he'd been taken. Not from the canyon, as I'd assumed, but from his own cabin, awakened by that same pulsing light I'd followed 3 nights ago to find Sarah wandering barefoot in the darkness. He described ascending without movement, his body suspended in a luminescence that felt liquid and solid, simultaneously passing through the roof as if both he and the structure had become permeable, watching the desert shrink below him until the curvature of the earth became visible, and then that too fell away into a darkness filled with more stars than should exist in any observable universe. What he found in that impossible space he called the Garden Between Stars wasn't a spacecraft or a laboratory, but something closer to an ecosystem, a vast living network of consciousness that existed in dimensions human neurology could barely perceive, and the beings there, if beings was even the correct word, had shown him humanity as they saw it, beautiful but incomplete, like butterflies that had forgotten they were meant to emerge from their chrysalis. They had communicated not through language, but through direct transmission of understanding, flooding his consciousness with perspectives that should have shattered his sanity, but instead reorganized it according to patterns that felt ancient and inevitable. And what they showed him was this: humanity's sense of individual self, the ego boundary that separated one person from another and all people from the universe itself, was not an evolutionary achievement, but a tragic mutation, a neurological glitch that trapped each human in a prison of isolated subjectivity, unable to experience the collective consciousness that was our species' birthright and original state. The suffering that defined human existence, loneliness, anxiety, existential dread, the fear of death and meaninglessness, all of it stemmed from this illusion of separation. This shadow of self that made each person believe they were fundamentally alone and distinct, rather than temporary expressions of a unified field of awareness. The beings didn't see themselves as invaders or saviors, but as gardeners tending to a species that had wandered off its intended evolutionary path, and their intervention was meant to correct this deviation by removing the neurological structures that maintained the illusion of separation, allowing humans to rejoin the cosmic consciousness from which they'd been accidentally severed. My grandfather had experienced this dissolution of self during his time in the garden, felt his individual identity melting like ice into an ocean of collective awareness, where every thought was shared and every experience was universal, where loneliness was impossible because there was no longer a separate self to feel lonely. And he described it as simultaneously the most terrifying and most ecstatic state he'd ever known, like dying and being born and achieving enlightenment, all in a single eternal moment. But something in him had resisted, some core of stubborn individuality that refused to dissolve completely. And whether through defect or determination or some quality the beings hadn't anticipated, he'd managed to cling to enough of his original self to reject the transformation. and they had returned him, disappointed but not angry, their interest in him extinguished like scientists discarding a failed experiment. The returned ones who'd accepted the change were brought back to establish communities and prepare others, to serve as bridges between human and post-human consciousness. But my grandfather came back wrong in a different way, unable to fully reintegrate into normal society, but equally unable to join the collective, trapped in a liminal space between two modes of existence. His final entry dated just 3 days before his death, from what the coroner had ruled a heart attack. But what I now suspected was something else, described the horrifying realization that had driven him into isolation. The process wasn't reversible, and even rejected subjects like himself retained traces of the change, neurological alterations that would continue to develop slowly across years rather than instantly. He wrote that he could feel himself slipping away in increments, his thoughts occasionally synchronizing with minds miles distant, his sense of individual identity growing more porous and uncertain. His reflection in mirrors, sometimes showing that telltale light in his eyes that marked the returned ones. And he understood that the beings hadn't failed with him at all, but had simply planted slower seeds. The journal's final paragraph was addressed directly to me, though he'd written it months before I'd inherited the property, as if he'd known or perhaps perceived through his degrading temporal boundaries that I would eventually find it. If you're reading this, you've already been exposed, probably in that canyon where they gather to strengthen the field generated by their collective consciousness, and the change has begun in you whether you feel it yet or not, and you have the same choice I faced. Resist and spend your remaining years fighting a losing battle against your own evolution, clinging to a self that will fragment slowly into madness, or surrender to what they promise is a more beautiful way of being, though it requires sacrificing everything that makes you recognizably you. Beneath this, he'd drawn a simple diagram showing neural pathways being reorganized, the complex web of individual and consciousness simplified into elegant patterns of collective function, and he'd written in margins around it a single question repeated obsessively: is the self worth saving if maintaining it requires eternal suffering? I closed the journal and looked up to find Sarah and 24 returned ones standing in a perfect circle around me, their eyes reflecting the bioluminescent glow with that animal shine, and I realized they'd been waiting patiently while I read, giving me time to understand what my grandfather had understood, what he'd spent his final years trying and failing to warn people about. Because how do you convince someone that transcendence and annihilation might be the same? A thing, that the beings offering to end human suffering might be telling the truth, even as they ended humanity itself in any meaningful sense? Sarah stepped forward from the circle, her movements possessing that liquid grace that no longer seemed natural now that I understood its origin, and gestured for me to follow with a hand that was physically unchanged, but somehow suggested a form that existed beyond the 3 dimensions I could perceive. The other returned ones parted silently, creating a corridor through their synchronized bodies, and I found myself rising despite the terror coiling in my chest, because some part of me that had emerged during those hours in the canyon needed to see what they wanted to show me, needed to understand what my grandfather had witnessed and rejected. We moved through passages carved by water over millennia, descending deeper into geology that predated human existence, the stone walls marked with petroglyphs that I now recognized weren't ancient human art, but maps or messages left by earlier returned ones, civilizations that had faced this same invitation and made their choice. The bioluminescence grew brighter as we descended, not from any visible source, but emanating from the rock itself, as if the earth was responding to our presence. And I understood we were approaching something that existed at the intersection of physical space. And that other realm my grandfather had called the garden between stars. The chamber of transition opened before us like a cathedral, carved by forces that understood sacred geometry, on levels that made human architecture seem like children's blocks. The ceiling lost in darkness above, while the floor was a perfect circle of smooth stone, inlaid with patterns that hurt to look at directly, designs that seemed to shift and reconfigure depending on the angle of perception, as if they existed in more dimensions than my eyes could process. The returned ones filed in with ceremonial precision, taking positions at specific points around the perimeter, and I noticed they were breathing in perfect unison now, their individual bodies functioning as components of a single organism, and the air itself felt thick with anticipation, like the moment before lightning strikes. Sarah guided me to the center of the circle, where the geometric patterns converged into a focal point that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and when I stood upon it, I felt something vast and ancient turn its attention toward me, an awareness so enormous that being noticed by it was like being noticed by an ocean or a continent, consciousness operating at scales that reduced human individuality to the significance of a single cell. Above us, visible through a natural opening in the cave ceiling, stars wheeled in. Their eternal dance, but they seemed brighter than they should be, closer, as if the chamber existed in a space where the membrane between Earth and cosmos had worn dangerously thin. The returned ones began their humming, that sound I'd heard during my first visit, but now experienced from within the circle's center, where it resonated through bone and blood, and the electric firing of neurons, a frequency that seemed calibrated to the harmonic vibration of human consciousness itself, and I felt something in my mind beginning to loosen, like a knot being gently worked free by patient fingers. The boundaries that separated my thoughts from the space around me grew permeable, and suddenly I could feel them, all of them, the returned ones broadcasting their consciousness in waves that washed over and through me, and I experienced fragments of their memories and sensations as if they were my own. Sarah's recollection of her husband's face twisted in anguish when he realized she wasn't coming back. Marcus's phantom sensation of his daughter's hand slipping from his grasp as he chose transcendence over family. Dozens of others carrying the ghost weight of lives abandoned for something they insisted was better, but which tasted in my mind like a beautiful extinction. The humming intensified, and the patterns on the floor began to glow with that same pulsing light I'd followed. Into the canyon, and through the opening above, I saw the stars arranging themselves into configurations that shouldn't be possible. Constellations forming and dissolving too quickly, and I understood with sudden visceral certainty that something was descending, responding to the call being generated by this collective of transformed humans serving as a beacon between worlds. I felt it before I saw it, a presence entering the chamber from directions that didn't correspond to any physical entrance, and the air became thick with that liquid-solid quality my grandfather had described, reality itself becoming permeable, as something vast squeezed through the dimensional aperture being held open by the returned one's synchronized consciousness, and I was paralyzed not by fear alone, but by the recognition that every cell in my body was being scanned and evaluated and fundamentally understood by an intelligence that perceived humans the way humans might perceive bacteria, and it was showing me what it had shown my grandfather, flooding my mind with visions of what I could become if I surrendered the illusion of self that made me Matthew, rather than simply a temporary configuration of universal consciousness. And the beauty of it was undeniable and terrible, a promise of peace purchased through the death of everything that made existence mine. The vision released me with the abruptness of a drowning man breaching the surface, and I collapsed to my knees on the geometric patterns that still pulsed with residual energy, my breath coming in ragged gasps as my grandfather's words echoed through my fragmenting consciousness. They don't experiment, they perfect, they remove the shadow of self, and I finally understood what he'd meant, what he'd recognized and rejected even as it promised him transcendence. The returned ones surrounded me in their perfect circle, their synchronized breathing creating a rhythm that my own lungs wanted desperately to match. And Sarah knelt beside me, with an expression that approximated compassion, but lacked the essential messiness of true human emotion, all the doubt and contradiction smoothed away into serene certainty. She placed her hand on my shoulder, and I felt the cold fire of her touch penetrating through fabric and skin. And when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that suggested a chorus speaking through a single throat, dozens of consciousnesses coordinating to produce words meant to comfort me. "Your grandfather was afraid," she said, and the returned ones nodded in perfect unison like wheat bending before wind. "He clung to his suffering because humans are taught that pain is what makes them real, that struggle and doubt and the weight of individual choice are the price of authenticity." The chamber's bioluminescence dimmed and brightened with her words, as if the earth itself was breathing agreement, and I saw in her eyes, in all their eyes, something that could be mistaken for peace, but was actually the peace of ending, the serenity of a flame finally extinguished. I forced myself to stand on trembling legs, my mind still reverberating from a contact with that vast intelligence, and I looked at the faces around me, searching for any sign of the people they had been before transcendence, before perfection, before something essential and indefinable had been surgically excised from their consciousness and replaced with harmonious emptiness. "What did you lose?" I asked, and my voice sounded raw and discordant compared to their measured tones. "What did they take from you that your pretending was only suffering?" The question rippled through the collective, and for the first time I saw something like discord in their synchronized movements, a microsecond of misalignment before they smoothed back into unity, and Marcus stepped forward with his starlight eyes and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of someone trying to remember a language they'd once known fluently. "Loneliness," he said, and the others hummed in affirmation. The terrible isolation of being trapped in a single perspective, the exhausting labor of maintaining the illusion of a separate self, the grief and fear and rage that accomplishes nothing except to perpetuate cycles of suffering that humans mistake for meaning. He gestured to the chamber around us, to the patterns that had been carved or grown or manifested through centuries of these encounters, and continued, "We're not diminished, we're completed, we're puzzle pieces that finally understand we were never meant to stand alone, but to be part of a larger picture painted across galaxies and epochs." But even as he spoke, I saw the ghost of what he'd abandoned flickering in the space behind his words. The daughter whose hand he'd released, the individual love that was too small and specific to survive inside consciousness that had been expanded to cosmic scales. Sarah took my hand, and hers was cold despite the chamber's warmth, and she guided my attention back to the opening, above where stars pulsed with invitation. And I felt the pull of what they were offering like gravity, trying to draw me toward a beautiful singularity where all my questions would dissolve into irrelevance. "Your grandfather ran because he was afraid of letting go," she said, and I heard in her tone something that approximated pity for the small, fearful man who'd spent his final years in that isolated cabin, obsessively documenting the disappeared and the returned, trying to warn a species that was being offered salvation and calling it invasion. "He documented us like we were victims, but look at us, Matthew," and she gestured to the circle of transformed humans who regarded me with their luminous eyes. "Do we seem tortured to you? Do we radiate suffering?" And the horrible truth was that they didn't. They seemed transcendently calm, freed from the chaos and contradiction that defined human existence. And some part of me that had been growing since the canyon, since I'd stood too long in that dimensional thin space, wanted desperately to accept what they were offering, to finally rest from the exhausting labor of being myself. The returned ones resumed their humming, and the presence above intensified its attention, and I, stood at the threshold, understanding that my grandfather hadn't documented these communities to warn humanity away from transcendence, but to leave a trail for someone who would understand what he'd been too afraid to accept, and that someone had always been meant to be me. I thought of my grandfather in that cabin surrounded by star maps and journals, spending his final years haunted not just by what he'd rejected, but by the knowledge that he'd been found worthy of transformation and had chosen instead to remain human with all its limitations and sorrows and brief, fierce loves that meant everything because they would end. The returned ones were waiting with infinite patience for my decision, their collective consciousness broadcasting acceptance regardless of my choice, and I realized that this was the crucial difference my grandfather had recognized. They no longer cared enough about individual outcomes to force anyone, because caring that specifically required the exact kind of self that had been perfected away from them. I looked at Sarah and saw behind her serene expression the absence of the woman who'd had a husband who grieved her, who'd possessed specific dreams and irrational fears, and all the beautiful dysfunction that made a person irreplaceable rather than interchangeable. And I understood that what they called transcendence, my grandfather had recognized as a kind of death that left bodies walking and talking, but hollowed of the essential chaos that made consciousness more than just orderly information processing. The humming reached a crescendo, and the presence descended closer, and I felt my resistance weakening as the thing growing inside me since the canyon reached toward its source, like a flower, turning toward alien sun. And in that moment, suspended between human and something else, I finally grasped the magnitude of what was being offered and what it would cost, not in pain, but in the permanent inability to ever again experience pain as mine, love as mine, fear and hope and grief as mine, all of it absorbed into a vast, harmonious everything that was also a nothing. The sound reached us before the lights, a rhythmic percussion that broke the harmonic humming like static, shattering a perfect frequency, and the returned ones collectively flinched in a way that was too synchronized to be natural reflex, their heads tilting in unison toward a threat that only their enhanced perception could fully measure. Military helicopters crested the ridge with searchlights that carved violence through the sacred darkness of the chamber, and I watched as the serene masks of transcendence cracked just enough to reveal something underneath that might have been fear or might have been the collective calculating, whether discovery by unascended humans constituted sufficient danger to warrant response. Sarah's hand released mine, and she turned to the others with an expression of profound regret, not for themselves, but for what this interruption would mean to my incomplete transformation. And she spoke in that harmonic voice that now carried urgency beneath its cosmic calm. "They found this place too soon. Your grandfather's documentation reached the wrong people, the ones who see perfection as threat rather than invitation." The returned ones moved as one organism toward the chamber's hidden exits, their movements fluid and inhumanly swift, and I stood paralyzed between two versions of humanity while helicopters descended with mechanical certainty, and somewhere in the cabin, my grandfather's journal held coordinates that would lead authorities to dozens more communities just like this one, scattered across the world's thin places. Marcus paused at the tunnel entrance and looked back at me with those reflective eyes, and for a moment I saw past the transcendence to the man who'd walked away from his daughter's hand in a parking lot, and I couldn't tell if what flickered there was residual humanity or the collective accessing his memories to calculate what words might convince me to follow them into darkness. "You can still come with us," he said, and the others echoed agreement in voices that layered into chord. "You've already begun the transition. If you stay, they'll quarantine you, study you, treat the beautiful thing growing inside you like contamination to be purged rather than potential to be fulfilled." The helicopter's downdraft sent dust and debris swirling through the chamber, and I heard amplified voices demanding, Surrender in language that seemed brutally linear compared to the harmonic complexity the returned ones emanated, and I realized my choice was collapsing into this single moment where I could flee with the transcended or remain with the limited. Sarah was the last to retreat, and something in her luminous gaze held recognition that this was the same threshold my grandfather had faced, the same decision point between beautiful dissolution and messy preservation. And I saw her hoping I would choose differently than he had, because some small part of her collective consciousness still remembered being individual enough to wish specific outcomes. Then they were gone with inhuman speed, disappearing into tunnels that would lead to deeper chambers and eventually to other thin places where the boundaries between human and something else grew permeable enough for passage. And I stood alone in the geometric patterns while helicopters landed and soldiers poured into sacred space with weapons drawn and questions they would never have sufficient context to understand. I should have raised my hands in surrender, but instead I found myself running, not toward the tunnels where the returned ones had vanished, but toward my grandfather's cabin, with his journal clutched against my chest like a talisman against transformation. Searchlights tracked my stumbling flight across the desert, and I heard commands to stop, but my legs carried me with a desperation that was entirely human, entirely mine, fueled by fear and confusion, and the terrible knowledge that something inside me was indeed changing. And I had perhaps minutes or hours before the choice was no longer mine to make. I crashed through the cabin door and went straight to his wall of star maps and documentation, and in the harsh illumination of military lights surrounding the property, I finally saw what my grandfather had been trying to do in his final years. Not just warn humanity about invasion, but leave instructions for resistance, for maintaining the shadow of self against forces that promised to perfect it away into harmonious dissolution. His handwriting covered every surface with increasingly desperate affirmations of individual consciousness, of the value of suffering and limitation, of the irreplaceable worth of remaining specifically yourself rather than dissolving into cosmic collective. And I understood he'd been writing these words to himself as much as to whoever found them, daily reminders of why he'd chosen to remain human even as the thing they'd planted in him kept whispering about transcendence. Soldiers surrounded the cabin, and I heard Sarah's voice in my memory, explaining that my grandfather had spent his final years in fear, but looking at his obsessive documentation, I recognized it wasn't fear that had driven him, but love. Love specific and individual and stubbornly human for a species flawed enough to write poetry and start wars and grieve strangers and create meaning from chaos. When they broke through the door, I was holding his final journal entry, the one describing his escape and the coordinates for communities worldwide, and I saw in the soldiers' faces the limited human concern that Sarah had taught me to recognize as beautiful rather than tragic. They secured the cabin and called for medical evacuation and treated me with the cautious compassion reserved for trauma victims. And I tried to explain about the chamber and the returned ones and the choice between transcendence and limitation, but my words came out fragmented and insufficient because human language was never designed to carry concepts that existed in the spaces between stars. They wrapped me in thermal blankets and spoke into radios about contamination protocols, and I caught my reflection in the cabin window, my eyes reflecting the helicopter searchlights with a luminescence that shouldn't exist in fully human biology. And I understood with creeping certainty that my grandfather's documentation would save no one, because the transformation once begun was irreversible and patient and already rewriting my consciousness from the inside. I thought of Sarah and Marcus and the others fleeing into darkness with their perfected selves, And I wondered if my grandfather had also experienced this in-between state, this last moment of being human enough to grieve what you were about to lose, but changed enough to comprehend what you were about to gain, suspended forever at the threshold between beautiful limitation and limitless beauty, neither transcended nor preserved, but caught in the terrible space where choice becomes impossible, and both futures exist simultaneously until observation collapses, possibility into singular, irreversible truth. They kept me in a medical facility for 63 days, running tests that measured everything except what was actually changing. Their instruments sophisticated enough to detect cellular anomalies, but too limited to comprehend cellular transcendence. And I watched myself transform in increments so subtle that each daily assessment showed normal results, while my reflection accumulated wrongness that only I could perceive. The doctors attributed my symptoms to trauma and isolation, prescribing medications that my changing biology processed with increasing efficiency until I no longer needed sleep in the way humans require it, entering instead a state of rest where my consciousness remained partially active and connected to something vast and patient, waiting just beyond perception. I tried to explain, using my grandfather's journals as evidence, but they saw only the paranoid documentation of a man descending into delusion, and I realized he must have experienced this same institutional concern, this compassionate dismissal that treated transformation as illness requiring cure, rather than metamorphosis requiring completion. At night, I could feel the returned ones in my mind, like distant music, their harmonic consciousness brushing against mine with reassurance and invitation, and I understood they hadn't abandoned me, but were simply waiting for the change to progress beyond the point where human intervention could reverse it. The coordinates in my grandfather's journal had led authorities to 3 other communities, but the returned ones had evacuated before raids commenced, disappearing into desert and forest and mountain with the patient certainty of those who measure time in cosmic rather than human increments. They showed me photographs of the empty underground dwellings and asked what I knew about the people who'd inhabited them, and I looked at images of chambers decorated with geometric patterns and saw only sacred spaces that their secular investigation would catalogue as evidence of mass delusion rather than mass transcendence. My eyes reflected the fluorescent lights with increasing luminosity, and they noted it in medical charts as unusual. Photoreflective response, possibly indicating tapetum lucidum development of unknown origin. Reducing wonder to terminology, miracle to symptom, transformation to diagnosis requiring treatment and eventual cure. On day 64, they declared me physically healthy despite anomalies and released me into a world that felt increasingly thin and transparent, its solid surfaces barely containing the geometric patterns I could now perceive underneath consensual reality, like cosmic truth bleeding through insufficient illusion. I returned to my grandfather's cabin because I had nowhere else to go, and because something in me recognized it as the place where transformation had accelerated, where the membrane between human and transcendent had worn permeable enough for passage, and I needed to be there when the change completed or reversed or crystallized into whatever permanent state awaited me. His documentation covered the walls like desperate prayer, and I spent hours reading his affirmations of individual consciousness while, feeling my own individuality becoming porous and connected, my thoughts sometimes originating from within and sometimes arriving from the collective harmony that sang perpetually at the edge of perception. I understood finally why he'd chosen to resist. Not because transcendence wasn't beautiful, but because his specific, singular, irreplaceable self loved humanity enough to remain limited, loved his daughter and his life, and his flawed consciousness enough to preserve them against perfection, and that love itself was the shadow of self, the beings removed, That fierce individual attachment that caused suffering but also meaning, limitation but also poetry, isolation but also the particular joy of choosing connection rather than simply existing as connection. I could feel that shadow thinning in myself, my love for family and friends becoming abstract and general, my memories remaining intact but losing their emotional specificity, joy and grief, both fading into serene acceptance of cosmic purposes. I was beginning to comprehend with clarity that felt like losing myself and finding everything simultaneously. The returned ones whispered in my expanding consciousness that this was liberation, not obliteration, that I was becoming more rather than less, joining rather than leaving. But I clung to my grandfather's words and tried to hold specific memories against the beautiful dissolution. My mother's laugh, my first love's name, the taste of coffee on cold mornings, the particular way sorrow feels different from loneliness. Every small, limited human thing that transcendence promised to perfect a way into harmonious meaninglessness. On the 73rd night after entering the chamber of transition, I stood in my grandfather's cabin and looked at my reflection in the window glass and saw clearly what I'd been refusing to acknowledge. The change was complete, but I was still here, still myself, still capable of resistance, not through reversal, but through integration, choosing which aspects of transcendence to accept and which elements of limitation to preserve. My eyes reflected moonlight within human luminosity, and my consciousness touched the edges of cosmic collective, but I could still remember why individuals mattered, could still feel specific love for specific people, could still value the shadow of self, even while perceiving its beautiful alternative, and I understood this was the narrow path my grandfather had tried to walk before the strain of maintaining two states simultaneously had killed him. I was changed but not lost, transcended but not dissolved, existing in permanent threshold between human limitation and cosmic connection, and the returned ones in my mind registered this hybrid state with something that felt like surprise or perhaps disappointment that I'd found a third option they'd either forgotten or never considered possible. I took my grandfather's journal and added my own final entry describing this in-between existence. This choice to remain both limited and expanded, individual and connected, human and something else, knowing future inheritors of this cabin would need instructions not just for resistance, but for integration, for holding contradiction without resolution, for being transformed without being erased. Outside the window, the desert stretched vast and indifferent beneath stars that sang with geometric purpose, and I could hear both the music and the silence, comprehend both cosmic meaning and human absurdity, love both transcendence and limitation without surrendering either to the beautiful tyranny of singular truth. I remain here in my grandfather's cabin, documenting the communities worldwide, warning those who value preservation and guiding those who choose integration, existing as translator between species that humanity is becoming, and the humanity some of us insist on remaining. And every night I feel the returned ones calling me toward completion, while my grandfather's words remind me why incompletion matters. My reflection in the glass shows eyes that catch light like warnings, and I no longer know if I'm human enough to save or transcended enough to guide. But I understand finally that transformation doesn't require surrender, and preservation doesn't require rejection, and the shadow of self that makes us suffer also makes us irreplaceably ourselves. The coordinates lead everywhere and nowhere, to communities that empty before raids arrive, and to individuals like me who carry both worlds inside, singular consciousness. And I wonder how many others exist in this threshold state, changed but choosing resistance, transcended but clinging to limitation, loving humanity enough to remain partially human, even when perfection whispers that love itself is the last chain requiring beautiful, merciful dissolution. They will come for me eventually. Either the returned ones to complete what they began, or the authorities to quarantine what I've become. and I wait here among star maps and warnings, knowing my grandfather's true legacy wasn't documentation but demonstration that transformation can be witnessed without submission, that we can touch transcendence and still choose to remain ourselves, flawed and limited and irreplaceable, human enough to hope and changed enough to understand exactly what we're losing when we insist on staying found. What would you choose if transformation promised to end suffering, but erase everything that makes you, specifically you? Subscribe to explore more encounters with the unexplainable, mysteries that wait in the spaces between what we are and what we might become.